Hey, want to spend a brief time taking a look at some of the prophecies that are in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel says an awful lot about the end times, but people don't study him too much. I guess it's a hard book to read, and the messianic prophecies and the prophecies about the end times, the end time wars, they get overshadowed. People tend to spend more time in Isaiah. They tend to spend more time in Daniel and Revelation. Ezekiel doesn't make the headlines too much, but he's got some pretty significant contributions to make to the end times. You know, just like Isaiah predicts a suffering servant, you know that Ezekiel actually predicts a good shepherd? Go figure. Ezekiel chapter 34 talks about false shepherds, folks who would use their position to exalt themselves at the expense of the flock. And oftentimes they would be quite abusive to the flock. But it didn't matter because they liked lining their own pocketbooks. This can be a political shepherd, as in the case of the King Jehoiakim, a very, very wicked man who was an extortioner, one who loved to oppress the people of God for his own profit. It can also be a spiritual shepherd, those false prophets who would be commissioned to usher the people of God into the presence of God, but instead they bring a watered-down message. Now, we've seen these false prophets be incredible thorns in the side to both Jeremiah in Jerusalem and Ezekiel out here in Babylon. And these false prophets are in the process of compromising words that are spoken by Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's the false prophet who says it's all going to be fine, there is never going to be any problem, and all is going to continue just like it was. And it's Jeremiah and Ezekiel who are saying, oh, there's going to be a very serious problem. We have sin, and sin needs to be dealt with. And these guys, they're more in number than Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They're also louder, and they can be violent if they want to get their point across. Well, Ezekiel chapter 34 addresses these shepherds who benefit themselves at the expense of the flock. We've also seen nowadays that some of these shepherds find it very, very lucrative as they use their ministry to line their own pocketbooks, once again, at the expense of the flock. That also, interestingly enough, would happen at the time of Christ. You know, you've read about these scribes and Pharisees who would, while they're offering long prayers, at the same time, they'd be devouring widows' houses. Well, what does that look like? Well, sometimes these religious leaders were called in to give advice on the dividing up of estates, and sometimes they would be used as jurists in trials, and in both cases, they would render advice or render decisions that would benefit their own pocketbook. So, what a horrible thing. While you're offering long prayers to vaunt the appearance of your spirituality, you're at the same time taking advantage of these widows who have experienced great loss. So people have found it to be very, very profitable to be a false prophet in the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and in the time of the New Testament, and we see it nowadays. Well, these guys who oppress the flock at the expense of the flock and to the benefit of their own pocketbook, God says eventually in Ezekiel 34:10 that he's going to demand his sheep back and make them cease from feeding sheep. He's going to bring them back to the land of Israel, and he says quite a few sentences there about the personal care and attention that he's going to give to his flock. We kind of expect something like that. God as a bare minimum, takes control of his flock, takes them from the false shepherds, and cares for them himself. But then God does something that is extraordinary. In verse 23 and following, that is Ezekiel 34:23, he speaks of one shepherd, his servant David, and he would raise up this one to dwell among them and care for them. That hasn't happened quite yet, but it starts to happen just a little bit. The shepherd is introduced in John chapter 10. Jesus is having a dialogue with the religious elite. And there he talks about the good shepherd, as opposed to the thief who just comes to steal and kill and destroy. There's coming a good shepherd, someone who is going to care for the flock. And when he says, I am the good shepherd, this is huge, because he's claiming to the religious elite, I'm the shepherd of Ezekiel chapter 34. I am the one who is going to replace you. And if any of those guys had been doing their devotional reading in Ezekiel chapter 34 anytime at all, that would be a very, very sobering warning to have him say, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the guy of Ezekiel chapter 34. Kind of huge there. A shepherd with a capital S. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 24, he prophesies of an ingathering that's going to take place. He prophesies there is a new relationship with God that is coming on the horizon. And I like it when these Old Testament guys like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they try to describe this new relationship with God. We call it the new birth. Ezekiel says, I'll take the heart of stone out of their flesh, and I'll give them a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit in them and cause them to walk in my statutes. Jeremiah says it's something like this in Jeremiah chapter 31. I'll put my law into their mind, and I'll write it upon their heart. So my relationship with the laws of God is a little bit different than the Old Testament saint. With them, it was written on tablets of stone. With people like you and I, the law is written in our minds and in our hearts. So it's the same law, just a different tablet. Do you ever stop to think that the Old Testament Ark of the Covenant, that holy sacred vessel that was so closely related to the presence of God, do you know what they put in that ark? They put, among a couple of other things, they put the original tablets of the covenant. The Ten Commandments were placed in that ark. God placed his laws into that sacred article that was so closely associated with his presence. Okay, now fast forward into the New Testament. What's the God of the New Testament do? He does the exact same thing as the God of the Old Testament. He places his laws into that which is associated with his presence. Go figure. See, in the Old Testament, it was the Ark of the Covenant. In the New Testament, it's people like you and I who are part of this new organism called the body of Christ. Body of Christ has been officially on this planet since the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, when God does a new thing. He reaches down to man and he places his spirit in man and he writes his laws on the inside. God of the Old Testament places his laws into that which is associated with his presence. God of the New Testament does the exact same thing. So what you have is, as you take a look at these two chapters, you have a good shepherd who comes along to bring an ingathering and to shepherd and disciple and care for the flock. And Then this new shepherd brings something new called the new birth. That's what we call it. But Ezekiel is doing the best he can with Old Testament verbiage to describe this new relationship that we have with the law of God. Now, the good shepherd brings about a new birth. And this new birth brings about life to a valley of dead bones. These dead bones represent Israel, spiritually dead. And yet life comes into this valley of dry bones, and they're given flesh and cause to stand on their feet, and they become a very great army. And this opens the door as this new life from the new birth, from the good shepherd, comes into the house of Israel. And there's a phenomenal awakening that is on its way. That opens the door for what I'm thinking is probably the greatest miracle in all the Bible. That's the joining together of Ezekiel's 2:6. Talk to you soon, okay?